Hello, welcome to Openly Spoken, the podcast to help you show up, speak out, and be seen. My name is Cilia. I am the host of the show, and today we are going to be talking about attachment theory with Taryn Newton Gill. Taryn Newton Gill is a conscious dating and relationship coach and an attachment expert, as well as the CEO and founder of Truer Love, where she helps people attract the love of their life using the psychological framework of attachment theory. Taryn also has a background as a professional matchmaker and life coach and is the producer of the Truer Love Stories podcast, where she anonymously coaches real people who are navigating a crossroads in their love life and interviews experts in the fields of relationships, psychology, and personal development. In today's episode, we are talking about attachment styles and relationships and all of the things that women will sometimes struggle with in relationships. And I just want to preface this with sometimes our languaging, we were speaking of relationships where it's men and women, but I want you to know that this stuff shows up in all relationships. We were just kind of like generalizing when we were talking about men and women and kind of talking about some of the research behind what attachment styles affect women generally more and what attachment styles affect men generally more. But I am very much aware that there's also a spectrum in between. Our non-binary friends are welcome to listen to this episode, and just know that that's the languaging that we used in this episode. Thank you so much for being here, and let's dive into today's podcast. I love that. That's a really good one. Good for grounding. I'm recording already.
Perfect.
Welcome to Openly Spoken, the podcast to help you show up, speak out, and be seen. On this podcast, we talk about self-love, relationships, sexuality, spirituality, and more. Hi, I am your host, Cilia Antoniou, and I am a relationship and sexuality coach for ambitious women with a history of toxic relationships who desire to reconnect to their sensuality and who desire to feel worthy of receiving healthy love. I celebrate you for hitting play on today's episode. I hope that you find this very supportive and helpful. And if you could show some support to the podcast by hitting subscribe on YouTube or on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify, wherever it is that you are listening to or watching this episode, it would mean the absolute world to me. Thank you so much for being here. Now let's dive into today's episode. Great. We're recording. Welcome, Taryn, to the show. I'm so excited to have you here.
Yay. Thanks for having me, Cilia. I'm so excited to be here.
Yes, I'm excited to have you, especially because we talk about self-love and relationships on this podcast a lot, and I have not touched on attachment theory at all. So I'm very excited to bring this tool and this knowledge and this info to the listeners. So very, very grateful.
Yeah, this is so relevant and related to all of those things, self-love and relationships. So I'm excited for them to hear it.
Yeah. So when did you first come across attachment theory? Like when in your journey with relationships did you find out about it and start exploring it?
Oh, I love that question. I discovered attachment truly after I had been in just another super toxic relationship. And I think had reached my rock bottom of dating. I had pretty much fallen in love with an old friend of mine who was an alcoholic, lived with his parents, had been in jail, really just not good stuff.
Triple threat.
Yeah, but which really just shows where my sense of self-worth was at, at that point, that I was willing to entertain that, But it's a confusing thing when you have feelings for someone and you love someone and the things you're willing to put up with and justify when you are in love with someone. and
Yes.
I still to this day love this man. I mean, when he wasn't drinking, he was like a puppy dog. He's one of the most artistic, beautiful souls. And it makes me so sad even now thinking about how he doesn't even realize that about himself,
Yeah.
And it kills me and everyone who was friends with him. But it helped me realize like I need help. And I have always been someone who likes to seek out answers and information. And it made me realize, I think, because I'd been in other relationships, not this exact situation, but always in situations where I wanted more out of the relationship. The person seemed into me and we seemed to have a connection, but it would never move forward. And I think just that situation, like he called me one night at 3 a.m., like drunk, lost, and had all like just gotten in a fight with someone on the street. And I was just like, okay, like this is too much, And so I started seeking out information, and then I would hear the word attachment style actually on podcasts because I loved listening to podcasts, but it would always kind of be in passing and I didn't fully understand like what it meant, but it was always interesting to me. And then one day when I had started seeing a therapist and I was talking to her about some guy I was dating, and I was like bringing up similar patterns, and she said, well, it's your attachment style. And I was like, wait, what is that? And so she had me read the book Attached. And, I don't know why I hadn't thought to read it from the podcast, but just the way she presented it, she gave it more context, I think, than I had heard on the podcast. Because I do think sometimes when people are already coaches or already in this, the self-growth world, they throw around expert language and they don't realize that other people aren't familiar yet with it. I even do it myself these days, and I try to be careful about it. And so I read that book and I just felt seen, like so deeply, and understood for the first time in my life. And I understood myself in a new way when I realized, oh, this entire time I have had an anxious attachment style and I didn't know it. And it's the reason I've been in these constant relationships with people that just are not giving me what I want or deserve in the way they're treating me, in the time they're giving me, in the way they're prioritizing me. And it was just like such a wake-up call. And the first thing I thought was like, why don't more people know about this? Like, why aren't we talking about this just like in our everyday lives? Because I like to say when you learn about attachment, especially your own style, and you feel understood for the first time, it's like putting on glasses after years of blurry vision, and suddenly everything comes into focus. Everything is more clear. Like the world makes sense on a new level. And I really think you just see a different, deeper level and layer of the world when you understand attachment. And I just became so passionate about it that it just kind of naturally led me to wanting to talk about it. And I'm still to this day, like so fascinated by it.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
So when you discovered attachment theory, you realized you had this anxious attachment, and that was what was creating this pattern in your relationships. And you also mentioned, because I know that there's a layer deeper, you mentioned earlier when you were saying like, my past like partner was like alcoholic, all these things. You said that shows you where my worth was at that point. And I think that's an important piece to go to, because yes, it's the attachment style, and what's underneath it is this belief of like, I'm not worthy, I'm not enough.
Yeah.
And that's really hard to deal with, because I have a history of toxic relationships as well.
Yeah.
And I've been in relationships where I'm like, why am I putting up with this?
Yeah.
And it was definitely a self-worth thing. Yeah.
Absolutely. And the thing about that I think is so confusing when you're sorting through it for yourself, first of all, if you don't have the language for it, right? You don't really know what you're experiencing. That was me for a long time. But the thing is, we talk about it as a belief, right? And I talk about that with my clients a lot. Like, this is a this is a subconscious belief, right? And I think a lot of the time we can cognitively understand that and recognize it and know what it means. But like, the truth is that the belief exists on a feeling, energetic level in your body.
100%. Yeah.
And so it's sometimes hard to identify that feeling. And I think it's also confusing when in so many other areas of your life, you're someone who is confident, who does feel worthy. That's how I was, because I had great friendships. I had great relationships with my family. Like, I was a makeup artist and I had fun and I made friends easily. But then when it came to relationships, like, I would crumble, and it just, like, there was this like disconnect.
Yeah.
Because I would date people, and one of my good friends, she would always say, like, you deserve so much more.
Yeah.
And I remember, like, I would hear her words and I would look at who I was dating and think, like, yeah, I can see why you think that. And I had no relationship to what that meant in my body. So, like, her words would just like bounce off of me, you know? And so I always tell people, like, the reason you want the information is because any healing journey starts with awareness, right? We have to have the awareness. We have to have the language to be able to mentally identify that thing that we're struggling with and understand where it's coming from. But the real work is then integrating that awareness with your feeling body and like embodying that, which is a hard thing to explain until you're doing it.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Totally agree with you. And also cognitively understanding what's going on kind of creates a sense of like safety with going into your body.
Totally.
Because you kind of know what to expect in a way.
Yeah.
And you know how to like identify what's happening. Like, oh, I'm feeling this way because of XYZ. Like,
yeah,
it's a little bit more explained.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's such a good point, Cilia. Yeah.
Yeah. So when did you start to take that information that you learned and start to go into the more of the body and emotion of it?
You ask really good questions.
Thank you.
Again, I was seeking out information. I was reading any book I could on dating and relationships, about attachment styles, like just really, created my own little mini course in dating and attachment, and learned that, dating multiple people was really recommended. And, there are multiple dating coaches who talk about the purpose of dating multiple people, which can sound kind of scary, especially to, romantics and people who we fall in love, we get attached, and we're like, I don't want to date anyone else. Like, I hate dating, I don't want to go on dates with strangers. That sounds terrible, But the thing I realized in like kind of co-studying dating and attachment was that the reason dating multiple people is helpful is because for especially someone who has an anxious attachment style, which the majority of people who are doing work around this have some level of anxious attachment. Typically, some avoidant types do it. I mean, and we can get into this, but the styles are on a spectrum. So some people are going to be more avoidant, some people are going to be less, but the less avoidance you have, the more ability you have to self-reflect, because with avoidance, you're a little disconnected from your feelings. And it's a little scarier to go deep into your feelings. So anxious types who want answers are more prone to be doing that kind of work. And that's actually how you start, like we're talking about, the awareness is how you start on that journey, right? What I realized was in dating multiple people for anxious types, what's going on is it's kind of diffusing the anxiety. Because what happens in an anxious attachment style, the full title of that style is anxious preoccupied. So the anxious type becomes preoccupied with getting the approval, validation, recognition of whoever it is that their attachment figure is, because they have an abandonment wound and they're preoccupied with not being left.
Yes.
Does that resonate with you?
Yes, that's definitely my attachment style.
Yes. There you go. Yeah. It's amazing when you're like, oh, that is me. Yes.
Yeah.
That's why it's fascinating, because it affects all of us, which I think is so beautiful about it. But anyway, so I like to use the analogy of like, if you're cooking, right? And let's say you're making a big pasta dish, and you have to boil this big pot of water, right? Well, you are naturally going to start with the pot, right? You're going to put the water in the pot and you're going to let it start to boil. And in the meantime, you're not going to sit and just wait for that pot to boil because it'll drive you mad, right? And waste time, right? So instead, you're going to go then start like chopping the vegetables or just prepping whatever else it is that you need to do for this dish, set the table, right? So that by the time that the water has boiled, you're ready to put in the pasta and, eat your meal, right? And so it's a similar thing that when we are anxious, preoccupied, and we become hyper-focused on someone, we become attached overly quickly, right? Because we suddenly don't want to lose them, even if we don't fully know who they are yet. Then we're waiting for their pot to boil, so to speak. We're just, and it's torturous, right? And we overthink everything because you have nothing else to focus on. And so by, starting to date multiple people, it really starts helping you understand what you need and diffuse your focus. And so that's what I started to do. And in doing that, I was really able to compare different types of people. And as I was helpful. But I was also, getting a lot of information and reading coaching books. And so my mindset was changing at the same time. And I think that combination of my mindset changing and me actively dating more people, that feeling piece of it started to shift. Okay. Right. Because I'm like, and that's how my program is set up for people, because studies have shown, I've come to learn after the fact, that actually that's how you have to change an attachment wound, how you heal an attachment wound, which is so interesting because I have so many clients or people who come to me and say like, I've been spending this whole past year in therapy and doing all this self-growth and this personal growth. And I thought I was doing so well. I was feeling so good and so confident. And then I started dating again and I'm feeling all the horrible things I used to feel about myself and I don't understand it. Right? Have you ever heard anyone say that before, yes. Cilia? Yeah. It's very common. And the reason for that is because we have this belief that we have to do all the healing work on our own to be this perfect version of ourselves, to attract the quality person who is going to want us, because those are, false beliefs about how manifestation work. There's a lot of that, like, just law of attraction. So I have to be this hyper quality person for a hyper quality person to want to be with me. Right. When actually what that's doing is making you think you have to be perfect, and then also looking for someone perfect, and no one's perfect, right? Yeah. So you're already setting yourself up to fail. Yeah. And you're reinforcing like, I'm not good enough, right? Because I have to reach this point of perfect healing to then start, right? But the truth is you'll never get to that level of healing because attachment wounds cannot be healed on your own.
Yeah, because it's in relationship, like it's how you're...
Exactly. Yeah. An attachment wound exists in relation to another person, and it becomes how you self-identify, because when originally that wound was formed as a child with, usually it's a primary caregiver or an early childhood experience where that wound becomes formed, where you start getting the message, I'm not good enough, right? It's subconscious. You're not saying those words to yourself. Again, it's a feeling. In certain situations that comes up, right? That stops us from speaking or stops us from doing or whatever it might be because we're feeling unworthy. Like, you have to be able to, oh my God, I'm losing my train of thought again.
It's okay.
This always happens. I tangent and then
it happens to me too. When I do solo episodes, I'm like, I lost my train of thought. If we're just going to hang out.
I love that.
You were talking about how the wound can't be completely healed on its own.
Yes. Thank you. So what that means is because it was formed with someone else, right? It needs to be healed with someone else. And that healing with someone else is how that feeling that feeling wound starts to change. Because you're essentially starting to feel more secure on a embodied level when you're making better choices for yourself in the context of someone else witnessing your vulnerability. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny you're putting into words like my journey with relationships, but I did not know anything about attachment styles.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew as well that like, you can do all the self-love work on your own, but then you're not like 100% there until you get triggered in a relationship and show up for the emotions and show up for like,
Yes.
what are they saying to you, and like learn how to
Exactly.
communicate not without violence, like nonverbal
Mm-hmm.
communication. But I did not realize that whole time it's like an attachment. So I feel like you're like explaining the like emotional journey I've been on.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah,
Totally.
it makes sense.
Yeah. And nonviolent communication, I think that's what you were just referencing.
Yeah.
Is amazing, because it's similar to something else I teach, and that in attachment literature we teach is effective communication.
Mm-hmm.
They're very related, and it's because you're communicating in a way where you're taking the other person's needs into consideration.
Yes.
As you communicate. And it's so much more effective that way, because we are less defensive and more present and more willing to go deeper when we feel acknowledged.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
And I feel like you also really learn how to confidently not abandon yourself and actually speak what you need to say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Instead of just holding it in and like acting like you're okay with what's happening when really you're like resenting the relationship. Yeah.
And that is how that embodied security starts to form. Because what you're doing each time you do that is you're subconsciously telling yourself, I am deserving of getting this need met.
Yeah.
This need for acceptance, for reassurance, for love, for whatever it is I need at this moment, even though it feels so scary and vulnerable, it's my truth.
Mm-hmm.
And if I'm going to be loved by this person and have a relationship with them, like, they need to see my truth. And if they can see my truth and reassure me and love me anyway, then it's like it's reinforcing, yeah, you're worthy of this love. Mm-hmm. Right. And so the same thing happens, but reciprocally in the opposite way, when we're in a relationship with someone who doesn't meet our needs. Right. They're reinforcing. That's why it's a self-fulfilling prophecy so much of the time, because like for me and that guy who I was in love with, right, like I already believed that about myself. So it didn't surprise me when he treated me that way.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It felt familiar because I'm used to people ignoring me, being mean, not wanting to commit to me, like me working for it. Like I was used to that feeling inside of me. And every time I chose someone like that who treated me like that, it's reinforcing, yeah, this is true. Mm-hmm. This is what you're deserving of. Because look, I have proof. All these other people have treated you this way. This person is too. Mm-hmm. Right. And so that's how our limiting beliefs are formed, because we don't realize we're like kind of creating the same cycle for ourselves. And then each time we do it, it's just more proof, more proof, more proof. So we stop believing that we deserve better treatment.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then sometimes when I just spoke to someone this week who was telling me, I found someone I connected with, they were treating me well, and then I ghosted them.
Yep.
Because I was like, oh my God, like they're treating me so, like, it's like, I broke up with my husband when I first met him for the same reason. We broke up for 7 months, and then I couldn't stop thinking about him. But it was the same thing. I wasn't used to being treated well, that like it freaked me out.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It is like, that's a whole journey in and of itself. Like when you're finally in that first healthy relationship and then you sabotage it, or maybe you notice that you're going to sabotage it and you're like, shit, I need help.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, totally. I mean, that's why I have a job and I exist, because
same.
Yeah. Because, it's one thing to understand it in your head, but then to move through it is the work.
Yeah.
And it's so scary, and also like the most beautiful thing ever.
Yeah. Can we go through what the attachment styles are?
Of course.
Yeah. Let's go through those.
One of my favorite topics.
There's also something that I wrote down that I want to ask you about. Mm-hmm. But I think I'll ask you that after we explain the attachment styles.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm ready.
Which one should we start with?
Well, I usually start with secure, because I think it sets
Makes
the
sense.
foundation for
like
understanding
the baseline.
Exactly. It's the baseline. And it's what I think we would all more naturally be attuned to if we lived in a world where more people felt safe with themselves, right? As when we're babies, like we can become securely attached when we have a caregiver who's present with us. Mm-hmm. And surprisingly, actually, the majority of people, even though it doesn't feel like it, are securely attached. Mm-hmm. I want to say like 50% of people are securely attached, but in the dating world, those people pair off more quickly. So then when you're on the apps or you're dating, like there are more, well, we'll get into it, but non-secure types, I'll say, or insecure types, but that doesn't mean that they're all that exist, right? And so I teach people how to identify the ones that are secure. So secure is essentially meaning that you are comfortable with closeness, with intimacy. You had, either primary caregivers or people early in your life, your parents, who you felt securely attached to, meaning you felt safe with them. You knew they were going to meet your needs. You knew they were going to give you emotional attention. You knew if you felt scared, they would soothe you, right? And you learned you could trust other people to be there for your emotional needs, which I always like to say our emotional needs are just as important as our physical needs. And there are studies to show that we need love to survive. And John Bowlby, who's the father of attachment, had done studies on orphans who had all their physical needs met, but weren't getting emotional love, and they still died in droves. I remember reading that sentence, they died in droves. And I thought that was so interesting. We need to feel safe. And the, human species evolved to love. We didn't used to have oxytocin back in the day.
Oh, but interesting. Cool.
Early humans who didn't have oxytocin died out. Wow. Because when we have oxytocin, we're more inclined to attach, which means we're more inclined to survive because we're safer surviving in packs when we're looking out for each other's needs.
Okay.
Right?
That makes sense.
So yeah, it's fascinating. And so literally getting love and reassurance is something we need to survive, right? Which is why our nervous system is involved in the situation. So when we're secure, we have a relatively calm nervous system, right? We feel safe in our bodies. We feel safe in our early environment. And so we are free to express ourselves, be ourselves, share our needs, and know that most of the time we're going to get them met, right? And so the insecure types then stem off of not getting those needs met in their early environments. But because it's a survival mechanism to need love, they turn to behavioral strategies to feel loved, to get that need for love and reassurance met. And safety met. So if you live in an environment where, for anxious types, so that's the next type. And again, the full title is anxious preoccupied. And that's because if you have typically one parent who is more secure, who you feel safe with the majority of the time, because we're always going to, again, this is not perfection, right? Like even secure parents can be dismissive sometimes or be busy and happen to ignore your need and not mean to, right? But what we're looking at is the consistency with which someone is emotionally available. And when we're looking at our own attachment style, that's how we start to understand it is how consistently am I doing these particular behaviors, right? Is that making sense?
Yeah.
So if you have a secure parent who you feel mostly safe with, but then you have another parent who's inconsistently emotionally available, meaning that sometimes you'll feel safe with them, but at the drop of a hat, you might not. That's what creates the anxious attachment style, because what's happening is that parent, you are feeling emotionally abandoned by that parent when you expect them to be there and they're not. Right? And so it creates this preoccupation in the child with getting validation, with getting approval, with getting reassurance from that parent that they're not going to leave. They're so afraid of that emotional abandonment that they start people pleasing, right? That's how people pleasing becomes a thing, because that child becomes more attuned to the parent's needs so that the parent won't emotionally abandon them. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So in that way, it's this like coping tool, right? People pleasing is so I can feel safe that my parent's not going to leave me because I don't want to upset them and have them suddenly do that again, right?
Yeah.
This is all subconscious in the child, and the child is, this is where the wound forms and those subconscious limiting beliefs form, because each time the parent abandons them, the child thinks, I'm not good enough, right? Children aren't able to put situations in context like adults, right? Their prefrontal cortex is not as developed. So they just take it at, face value. If my parent is mad at me now, is not emotionally there for me, I'm not safe, it must be me. Like I did something wrong. And so that's where the shame starts to develop with like asking for your needs met, right? And that fear of abandonment starts to grow. And then maybe it's a fear that you're already like waiting for in other relationships, because even though you have the secure parent, your preoccupation is with this other parent who's not getting your needs met. So that's why we hyper focus sometimes on what we're not getting, right? Versus what we are getting. But with an anxious type, because they had that more consistently secure parent, they know what security feels like and they crave it and they want it. And that's why anxious types are the closest to secure, because they do have a sense of, yes, it's safe to express this. And that's why anxious types often want to communicate. They really, really want to be good at communicating. Yeah. Do you relate to that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Like we're always like, we need to talk this out more. And what we're doing there is we're like looking for reassurance and that feeling of safety that we know should be there, but like isn't if you're dating someone more avoidant. Right. And so it's like becomes this like inner, like almost like competition with yourself. Like, can I get them to see me? Can I get them to validate me? And we become upset, like that's when you start feeling crazy. That's where that really negative connotation, especially about women, comes from. Like, she's so crazy. Well, she's not getting her needs met, actually, is what it's happening.
Yeah.
So that's the more anxious type. And so that's why it kind of can come out in not expressing your needs, in being passive aggressive, in being people pleasing. And what happens with the anxious type specifically is that the more they don't get their needs met, the more resentment grows, but they don't know how to express themselves or feel like they're deserving of expressing themselves. And so that's why they might be passive aggressive or blow up or get angry. So if you think about how our nervous system is formed, right, because this is based on survival. So our nervous system is intertwined. We have an attachment system that is composed of hormones like oxytocin and vasopressin. And so what happens is when we don't get that need met, and we start to flood with anxiety, the anxious nervous system wants to fight, right? Fight, flight, or freeze. The anxious one's like starts demanding attention and getting really upset, but is also like scared to demand that attention sometimes. And so it becomes resentment and then explodes or becomes passive aggressive. Or that's when you are not using nonviolent communication. You're so triggered that you're using very violent communication, right?
Yeah.
But that's the self-sabotaging part, because then the other person is not going to respond well to that, right? Especially someone avoidant. And the avoidant type is super afraid of those emotions, right? So an avoidant type is usually created by some level of neglect, actual abandonment, or just not having a secure parent at all to feel safe with. It might be that they had a single parent who was out a lot, right? Who maybe wasn't a quote unquote bad parent necessarily, but they weren't always available, right? Or were rarely available. Sometimes it's some level of abuse or something like that, where they very rarely got their emotional needs met. They didn't feel safe a lot of the time. And so they learned it's safer to depend on myself and to avoid those feelings altogether. And so whereas, the anxious type's nervous system goes to fight and it gets activated when it feels like they're not getting their needs met, avoidance just kind of as a protective mechanism start to numb. They have there's this I don't know what it is exactly, but a chemical that starts numbing you from your emotions if you're really avoidant. So when avoidant types are like, I don't really know how I feel, right? Or it's easy for them to move on after a relationship, or they don't know how to communicate, or they ghost. It's because they literally are cut off from feeling their emotions to a degree. And so they can't even begin to name them sometimes. Right. And so they don't know, they don't associate people with being safe anymore.
Yeah.
Right. And they learn how to self-soothe because they're like, I have to depend on myself, and they become hyper independent, and they start having rigid boundaries, and they use distancing mechanisms like subconsciously to kind of keep people out anytime you get too close, So their kind of wound, if you will, is that they're defective and don't know how to love. And so vulnerability is really scary, and they would rather not be a burden to you. They actually have a fear of disappointing anyone because they think that they don't know how to meet emotional needs because their emotional needs weren't met. And so they're like terrified that you're going to be disappointed in them because that's what they got a lot from their caregivers, likely, you know? And so the wound for an anxious type, just to explicitly say it, is abandonment. Even if you weren't physically abandoned, most of the time you actually weren't, but it's an emotional abandonment wound. Someone's going to leave me. They're going to leave me. But the avoidant type is that the wound is not actively abandonment in the same way. It's more, I'm defective. I'm going to disappoint them. I can't be vulnerable because if I show my true self, they will reject me. And so this is really interesting. I learned this from another love coach once and I just was like, that's like wisdom drop right there. Anxious types are very aware of their abandonment wound because it shows up a lot in relationship. Like they're always like kind of having the thought like they might not use that language, oh, I have an abandonment wound, but like they're afraid someone's going to leave, or if I show my real self, or they're very aware of that. But they actually have a fear of intimacy. Right? So they do have the abandonment wound and they're aware of it, but they're not aware that they also are afraid of intimacy.
Yeah, and that's why they're people pleasing, because
exactly.
The people pleasing is all like that's also trauma response. Like you mentioned fight or flight, but there's also fawn, where you're like acting like everything's okay.
I've never heard that one before.
Yeah, that's
Celia.
like a newer one. I don't know when it was like started to talk about, but it's like a fourth one, and that's like it's supposedly very common in women.
That makes
because we're taught to be
sense.
Like perfect.
Yes. Wow, that's really interesting. Yeah. So, what were we saying before that?
We were talking about how anxious attachment style people have a fear of intimacy.
Yes. So that fear of intimacy exactly is I'm afraid to show who I really am because you might leave me. Right. Even though I want intimacy more than anything, like I think I want it more than anything, but when it actually comes, that's what we were talking about before. Like you almost like, when you get it, you like push it away because it's so scary, right? Because they're actually giving it to you now. Whereas avoidant types are very aware of their fear of intimacy, right? They're aware that commitment scares them. They're on a certain level, right? But they don't realize they also have an abandonment wound. That the reason commitment scares them or being close scares them is because they're afraid of being abandoned.
But they don't know that they're afraid of
but
that.
They're not aware of it, right? So it's like these two styles are so interesting. So those are the two main insecure styles, and they're fascinating because they attract each other on a certain level, because someone who is used to being hyper aware of someone else's needs, like the anxious type, right? And fawning, right? They like anxious types tend to be like very warm, affectionate, just like very loving and hold space for other people naturally because they're so in tune with other people's needs because they were so preoccupied with that parent's needs, right? And as avoidant types who aren't used to people meeting their needs, it feels really good at first. It really feels really good to connect in that emotionally grounding way, right? But what happens is that they also simultaneously trigger each other and have opposing needs because as they begin to get closer, the anxious type's abandonment wound will start to rear its ugly head a little bit. I don't even want to say ugly because that's not I think it's a beautiful thing that we have wounds. But it just starts to show up, right?
Yeah.
And that's really intimidating and scary and overwhelming for the avoidant type who, when they start seeing that raised emotion, because anytime in the avoidance nervous system, they get dysregulated, even sometimes when they're excited about someone, right? For like it feels good, they still can get scared because they'd rather be like, just like baseline, like regulated level, like being dysregulated in some way really scares them. And so if they get overwhelmed with the anxious types, like needing the reassurance, right? Like you might, like their abandonment starts to get triggered and it scares that avoidant person. And so then their way to cope is to withdraw, right? Which then only heightens the anxious person's anxiety that they're going to be abandoned. And so that's when the demanding starts, and that's when it starts to turn really quickly, right?
Yeah.
Because their needs, one has a need for space, one has a need for reassurance, and they're like opposing.
Yeah.
But we get in those relationships easily because personality wise, they tend to work more, or they tend to have chemistry, right? They like in the beginning.
Yeah.
So it's a very common dynamic, and it actually has a name. It's called the anxious avoidant trap. So like when you have like a lot of on again, off again relationships, which I used to have, like that's a sign like you might be in an anxious avoidant trap.
Oh, interesting.
Because like you want to be together, but then you're not sorting through issues well together. Neither of you have the coping tools to like show up securely to the situation, and someone needs to show up securely to inspire the other person to show up securely. So it just becomes this like push and pull and tug of war constantly, and it just becomes too much for everyone, you know, and then someone ghosts or there's a shift, or it's really a lot of why people, I think, remain single.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And would avoidant types remain single longer? Like that seems like that would make sense. Or is it the same in both groups?
I think it depends on the person, you know. I think that maybe yes, because if an anxious type is willing to start dating someone more secure, they can have a better chance of shifting. I'd say the way to make it work with someone avoidant is, on one hand, you can either start to become more secure yourself and you become the secure base in that relationship. And if they are not, you know, hyper on the spectrum of avoidance, right? They're not a full dismissive avoidant, or at least they're someone who has a certain level of awareness and is willing to do some of the work, then they might start becoming more secure with you, right? But you have to really ground down into your own security to make that happen. Otherwise, what happens with someone avoidant, typically when those relationships last, it creates a really dysfunctional relationship that I'm sure all of us have witnessed from like boomer parents or something like that, where the avoidant person is the primary person who's getting their needs met. And the anxious people pleaser is kind of swallowing their needs to take care of the avoidant person, to keep everything remaining copacetic, right? Like they're not getting their emotional needs fully met. And this is honestly why I think stereotypically we think of men as more avoidant and women as more anxious, because naturally in the way men and women are socialized, you know, men are taught to not show their emotions, and women are taught to be warm and affectionate and to be nurturing and be okay and have more resilience.
Be perfect and
be perfect, and to take the blame for things more easily, you know, and to like sacrifice what they need because they do it with their children. And, you know, so it's like, it's just reinforcing these attachment styles. And so it's hard to sometimes unpack what is culture and nurture and how we were taught to think about ourselves, and what is like our biological, psychological baseline. You know what I mean?
That's so interesting to look at all the different layers that come in and affect a relationship. I find that very, very fascinating.
Well, and because we also have so many cultural beliefs about what love should look like and femininity should look like, and which is why, you know, I believe in the divine feminine and masculine, and those are definitely energies, but I think I disappoint people sometimes who are like, I just need to be more feminine and I really want to lean into my feminine. And I just am really trying to stray away from making it all about gender, because I do think gender plays a role energetically, but I also think that in the dating world, there is way more importance placed on gender than is necessary. I think we're more alike than different at the end of the day. And yes, we're socialized differently sometimes, but I think when you can understand your deeper emotional needs, gender takes the back seat.
I also think when people like if you really dive into divine feminine work, I feel like the message really, it's not be more womanly or be more girly. In my opinion, it's be more connected to your body. Whereas like the masculine work is be more connected to like more positive beliefs or like a stronger mindset. Like how we were talking about earlier, how there's that cognitive, but then there's also the feeling. That's how I view masculine and feminine, like the cognitive and belief work and affirmations and all that stuff is masculine. And for me, it doesn't have anything to do with gender, but I get you on that. And it's hard to talk about those terms without being like, women should do this and like men should do that. Yeah.
Exactly. And and that makes sense to me, I think, in the way you're describing masculine and feminine, in that masculine energy tends to be more logical, rational, heady, right? Action oriented. And that is very aligned with someone who's more avoidant.
Yeah.
Cut off from their feelings, right? Maybe are more physically in their body, but they're not in their emotional body is the same way as a woman. But women, it sounds like what you're saying, we're sometimes disconnected from our physical bodies. Yeah. Right? Maybe because we have a lot of shame around our physical bodies or whatever the case may be.
So much shame. We're not taught about our anatomy growing up. Right. Like there's so many things.
Yeah. I mean,
it's a whole different podcast.
That is a whole different podcast, but it is. Oh yeah. I'm interested in doing that podcast if you want to. But and I think that women, what was I going to say? The whole concept of women being more about when you're in your feminine, yes, you are receiving, you are present in your body, you are allowing yourself to feel your body, or to feel your sensuality, to feel your needs, right? To receive someone who can meet those needs, right? Like, is the more energetic feminine, I think women are often looking to embrace, right?
Yeah.
And I think that is a very empowering thing. I just, want to caution people, like, and I know, I just want to say too, I know what women mean when they really want a masculine man who's a provider. And I think sometimes they think that means money. And I'm always like, does it have to mean money though? Like, stability, yes. But like, a man who's masculine is going to be emotionally in touch and take care of your emotional needs too. And I just think there's so much confusion around that. Yeah. That it really gets us tripped up sometimes and in our heads about what we want and what we need and what we're looking for.
Definitely. Yeah. I wanted to ask you as well with attachment styles. I talked to this with a friend of mine a couple of months ago. We were talking about how attachment can shift. Like, she was saying that she doesn't like to label herself as like a certain attachment style because she realizes she shows up differently with her relationship with her mom or like her friends or her husband, or like she notices the differences. So can you speak to like how it like can shift and change?
Absolutely. And I do want to say there is one other attachment style, the fearful avoidant, disorganized, anxious avoidant. There's many names for it.
We got off on a tangent.
But I think it's related to kind of what you're asking, in that, relational attachment is kind of what you're talking about, in that we have a different style that can come out in different relationships depending on what that other person's attachment style is, right? Whereas a fearful avoidant tends to oscillate more frequently and could oscillate in the same relationship. Does that make sense? So someone who's fearful avoidant longs for closeness and can become preoccupied in the way that someone anxious does. And they did have a certain level of security, but on a dime, they can feel scared that person's going to leave. And their response, rather than it being more a typically anxious response, can be rather to avoid. Whereas a typically anxious response would be to demand or to people please or something like that. The avoidant type suddenly gets super scared, freezes, and like avoids, like an avoidant does. So that's to say that a lot of people think they're that style because of this relational issue, right? Because they're like, well, I also have avoidance, right? But again, going back to what we were talking about, how our styles develop in the first place is how consistently available a parent is, right? And so like someone fearful avoidant, they typically had two inconsistent parents. So they never knew when they would be safe and when they wouldn't. which is why they can flip on a dime. And they do have some very specific behaviors in that regard that are just very fearful avoidant and very distinct. And some places, you know, some researchers, some experts don't always talk about that style. And I say fearful avoidant because that's the paradigm I learned. But it's the same thing as disorganized, or I think I've actually heard that they call it disorganized in children, but fearful avoidant in adults. There's so many different like beliefs around this, but this is all to say that, again, we're talking about consistency. So like typically under stress, like what are the behaviors you go to, right? More often. And sometimes that's not even in relation to a person, but a situation, because often our attachment style shows up in our relationship to things as well, like money, career.
Yeah.
You
Isn't
know,
that interesting?
It's so fascinating. But other survival needs, right? Our attachment style can get triggered. So if you're more typically getting anxious about something, you're likely more anxious, right? Or if you're typically avoiding something, you're typically more avoidant. It is a spectrum, right? And I can appreciate someone not wanting to label it, because it does kind of give the impression that they're more stagnant than they are, right? And I think it helps our brain to talk about it this way, because again, we have to have that cognitive awareness first, and the human brain likes to categorize and make sense of things. So I think when we have these kind of benchmarks or these pillars of styles, then we can understand the gray areas of them a little more, right? As like, so they're like almost starting points. And so, yes, like as someone anxious for myself, right? Like if I'm around someone avoidant, will get triggered more easily and become more anxious, right? And start displaying my anxious thoughts, my anxious behaviors, my anxious strategies. And then if I'm around someone who's more anxious, I might start feeling more avoidant, because they're triggering in me like an overwhelm of it, like being too anxious, and I like have to step away, you know? And then especially around someone more secure, anxious types start to become more secure, right? And avoidant types can become more secure. So that's why who you surround yourself by is so important, because the more you're consistently around that style, who you're going to have a certain reaction to, right? The more you might lean into whatever style is coming out when you're around them, right? So that's why if you're anxious and you're constantly dating avoidant people, you're going to feel more anxious more of the time. And then you're going to continue to go to that style and those behaviors and those feelings more of the time. Does that make sense? And that's what kind of makes you lean more anxious. And so it's just like these patterns and these cycles we get stuck in. But I think it does, again, go back to that level of consistency and what you go to when you're in stress, because your attachment style behaviors come out under stress. Right. So that's why you can date someone and you're like, it's so wonderful, we're having an amazing time, and then some small thing happens in the road and suddenly like everything feels different and you don't feel like you know them at all. And it's because you both hit a stumbling block that made you feel stressed out, and now the way you're showing up under stress is different than how you were both showing up previously. Right. Which is why when people avoid sharing their needs till 3 months in, well, like, yeah, that's why that's happening. Right. Like we need to share our needs earlier so we can experience stress together sooner and decide if we can work through that stress together.
That's a good point.
Yeah. But does that answer your question, or like,
do
you have other thoughts on that?
I don't think
the relational
so.
piece.
I do have a thought on, I learned this new term a few months ago, and I felt like very much like, oh, wow. Like I felt like my past self was really being seen.
Yeah.
And, it's very similar to what you were saying about anxious attachment, how like we can be like, if we're like romantics, we get like attached really quickly. Have you heard of this term called limerence?
Yes. I forget what it means, but I know I've heard it.
Yeah. I watched like disclaimer, I have not researched this besides like the one YouTube video that I watched that was like a psychologist talking about it.
Yeah.
Like a therapist or someone. And she was saying how like limerence is what happens when like you meet someone, you barely know them, and then you're already starting to like have all these fantasies in your head and like
Yes.
you're already like in love with them when you don't even know them at all.
Yeah.
And you're like creating, like you're like daydreaming about them and like creating this whole relationship in your head that's not actually happening.
Yes, I know exactly what that is. That's so funny. I forgot about that word, but I talk about it all the time. I call it the fantasy mindset.
Nice. Okay.
Yeah, in relation to the secure mindset. Right? And that's when we're projecting our fantasy of what we want to happen onto someone we don't fully know yet.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then we think that person is that way when really they're a total stranger.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, 100%. It's such a thing. And I do think women are more vulnerable to it because we're the ones who all of that messaging around our worth being caught up in a man choosing us.
Yeah, thanks, Disney.
Right? Exactly. And it sucks because I really love Disney movies. And I'm like, do I show them to my daughter? I'll show her Moana and like the strong ladies, and with a caveat Frozen. If I have to show her other ones. Right, Frozen. I mean, I'm so glad our Disney movies are shifting in that regard.
Right.
Because we do need women to understand who they are without being in the shadow of a man or like a man completing them. Right.
Yes.
And I lived with that for so long because I wanted a relationship, but I, like the independent woman in me was like, I don't need a relationship. And so I would like go to swing to this other extreme. Right. But yeah, that's all to say. I do think that that's the culture piece again, is that we're fed this romantic fantasy thing that I think men are less vulnerable to.
Yeah, like you don't see boys like planning their weddings when they're in elementary school.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And, you know, I do think there is a certain biological level of like women are more, tend to be, not always, right? But like, again, it's a spectrum. Gender's a spectrum. Women tend to be more like wanting to nurture and being in touch with their emotions and relationships. And wanting relationships is what I just said, if you couldn't understand it. But I don't think that women should be taught that they're not complete without a partner, whether it's male, female, anyone, you know.
Because that not only like harms the women, it harms the relationships they're going to get into. Yeah. Because I think both people should feel complete already, and like they come together, and like that's why I really don't like the term like other half. Like my husband is not my other half. Like we're both wholes.
Yes.
We're both whole people.
Yeah, totally. Same. Yeah, it's very toxic. And I think it's a disservice to the men too, because then, you know, they kind of are not getting the full experience of a full woman either, you know? And I think that men tend to get more cut off from their own emotions and, I don't know, like what they need, because you know, whereas women, I think, are like, you need a man to survive. Men are like, you don't need anyone, and you have to be the best. And, you know, like they get different messaging about like toxic masculinity, you know? And I think men are taught to be more confident with themselves in a different way than women because of this.
I really envy that.
Yeah. And so there's like a positive to it, but yeah, I think it just does them a disservice as well, because then they're in relationships with women who aren't going to challenge them in the way they need to be challenged, you know, emotionally speaking, or just they're not in a relationship with an equal, you know. And I think that if you're more traditional and you're okay with that like traditional unequal dynamic, then okay, good for you. But I feel like most modern people want a partner these days who is not the same as them when we say equal, but you each are bringing something similar to the relationship, even if that's complementing each other, right? Yeah.
When you say that, that one good thing is that the men are usually taught to have like more confidence. What do you think is maybe a good thing that women are taught? I'm so curious to know, because I have a thought of it about what it might be. Yeah.
Well, I think women are taught that it's okay for them to have emotions.
Yes, that's one I did not think of. Yes, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, nobody bats an eye if a woman is like crying on the phone with her friend.
Right.
Yeah.
There's actually studies that show that the reason women live longer, one of the reasons that they believe women live longer is because they're always, or they, I don't want to say always, they often have closer relationships in their life.
Yes.
And so they're able to express their feelings more. And so there's literally less of a weight on their heart physically, because the tension we feel sometimes when we're not expressing our emotions, or they're not being processed or moving through us, right, is that they get stuck. And so we're like tenser, we're tighter, and when you can express your emotions and release them and be at peace with them, your heart, like, you breathe a little easier, right? Your body is a little healthier in that regard. And that's why it shows men who are married tend to live longer, because usually if they're in a happy marriage and they have a wife or a partner, who is helping them express their emotions. Like my husband has become a much more expressive person, or is more, I think, in tune with his emotions since being with me, and he is a secure man who's always had a big heart, but he didn't used to express it so freely, So I think that there is a power in that, but I think we get it misconstrued with nurturing and like getting other people's needs met.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Because we're so in touch with our emotions, it's like we enmesh more easily, maybe.
Yeah.
Because we're not confident in ourselves. So it's like we attach to them more.
Yeah.
But what's your idea of what women's strength is?
Mine is probably just limited to my own life experience, but I think that women our creativity is nurtured more.
I could see that.
Like it shows up in like fashion, we can wear dresses and pants and makeup and all this stuff. And that's like shifting a little bit. I feel like it's not as like weird these days if like a man is wearing nail polish and makeup. And maybe that's also limited because I'm in Los Angeles and I've also lived in New York City where people are a little bit more free.
Yeah.
That's what I was going to say.
I love that. And I actually think that's related to us being more comfortable or like encouraged to feel emotions, because I think we're taught to explore emotions, and that's what creativity is to a degree. It's expressing yourself.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's cool. Thanks for making that connection, because I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
Love it.
But I've actually never thought of it in terms of creativity, but that absolutely makes sense too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Whereas like, I think men do tend to lean towards that stereotype of like being structured, like that kind of hyper masculine we were talking about earlier, rational, like on top of things, right? Like they have to be that way versus allowing themselves to express and be creative. Yeah. That's so interesting.
I'd love to move into some closing questions.
Okay.
Firstly, to kind of close out our conversation, I know you wanted to end on a positive note, and I would love to know, like, what do you want to leave people with that are here learning about attachment style and wanting to change their relationships?
Yeah. Thank you for asking that, Cilia. I think something I always want to remind people of is that the beautiful thing is that our attachment styles are on a spectrum, which means they're malleable and they can change, right? And that's the really inspiring part of all of this, is that wherever you're starting is awareness, right? And being able to say out loud, oh, that's a style I identify with. It might not fully encapsulate me all the time, like you were talking about with your friend, but I identify with certain traits of that style, and I can now recognize these behaviors in myself and understand why they're there and where they're coming from. I think that alone is a beautiful thing. But then also knowing that, attachment styles are not a pathology, meaning they're not a disease, right? It's not that something's wrong with you. It's actually the most human thing that you would try to do your best to get love, because that's how you're wired as a human. It's like the most human thing ever. And I think it's so beautiful. And so we're not looking to fix your attachment style. And that's language that I really want to bring awareness to, because I get that question a lot. How do I fix my attachment style? And so it's not about fixing it. It's about managing it. Right. And so just having your awareness of it to start, which hopefully, you received in this episode if you're listening to it and didn't know about them before, like you're already on the path, because it's truly amazing. Like I see this in my clients all the time when like they become so aware of attachment, you start seeing it everywhere. And again, you just start understanding a new layer of the world. And I think that that is so powerful. And then the more awareness you have around it, and then you start gaining tools for moving towards that embodied sense of security, right? Like, it starts to change how you feel about everything. It starts to change your orientation with the world. So doing attachment work will lead you to healthier relationships and more happiness, but it will also lead you to a better relationship with yourself, a better relationship with your family, your friends, your work life. It's such a powerful thing. It gets to the root of so many self-worth type stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It's so many self-worth wounds that the majority of us have on a certain level.
Yeah.
Right. But I find this work so inspiring because when you become aware of it, that alone puts you on the path towards healing it.
Mm-hmm.
So just know that even if you relate to being hyper anxious or hyper avoidant or really fearful avoidant, and it feels like a really daunting thing, I think, when you first learn about it, like, oh, I have to change my attachment style. Like, it's so daunting, but it's something that's a process and you go slowly. I work with my clients for like 9 months to a year doing this stuff to really help them start to get to that embodied place with security, So I just always want to leave on that note and remind people of that like, even if it feels like really daunting or like, oh my goodness, I have a lot of work to do. Like, the research shows, studies show, like, this isn't just like my opinion, you can get there. You can change your attachment style.
Yeah. I love the highlighting of the language of fixing. And that you're not here to fix, because I feel like when we come to any kind of self-development work with this need to fix ourselves, it's further feeding into that core wound of I'm not worthy, like something's wrong with me.
100%.
And the work is really all about like getting to a point where it's like, you're fine as you are right now. Yes, you have some struggles, but you're still worthy and okay already.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, you were born worthy.
Yeah.
You were born worthy. Like, I think about my daughter and like it doesn't matter what anyone says or does. Like, she is already worthy and she will always be worthy no matter what another person says, and I hope I can instill that in her. If there's anything I want to instill in her, it's that she's worthy, because we would never say a baby's unworthy of getting their needs met.
Right? Oh my gosh.
we're horrified at the thought of that, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So why would you be any less worthy? A baby doesn't have to prove anything to be worthy.
Yeah.
Neither do you.
Has having a baby shifted how you like view people and humans and attachment and relationship and all of the things we've talked about? Like, has it?
I don't know if it's shifted my view as much as grounded me more in accepting myself, actually.
Yeah.
In my own wounds, because I do think that children reflect back to us our greatest weaknesses, our greatest fears, our greatest wounds, and just thinking about, like, on that note of worthiness, like body image has always been a thing for me. And I had a lot of fear I was working through with my therapist around my daughter and me projecting my ideals of beauty on her, like my shame about my body, or my, just different things like that, like the way that I talk about myself. Because yes, children learn through you telling them things, but they really learn through observing you. Yeah. Right. And if I'm going to be saying something mean to myself, whether it's about my body or something else, like, my daughter will absorb that about herself, and I really think that for me to make sure that she feels good in herself, it's my job as her mother to continue to work on feeling good about myself. So I think in that way it's helped me, and really leaning even more into the idea of, like, love yourself as you are. And that doesn't mean you're not going to grow or change, or you shouldn't strive for more, but that if you're accepting yourself just as you are, you're already worthy, like that concept, you're not doing those things or changing to be more worthy, right? Yeah. Maybe I'm changing to be healthier or to feel better in my clothes or whatever that might be, but it's not to be worthy, and so yeah, I think in that way it's shifted things for me.
I feel like that goes really well into the next question that I ask every guest.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing.
Mm-hmm.
What does self-love mean to you?
Yeah, that does go nicely into that question. I think self-love is exactly what we were just saying, is knowing on a embodied level you are worthy
Mm-hmm.
of being treated with respect, of being given the time to be heard, and seen, and the acknowledgement, the space to live your truth,
Mm-hmm.
and to knowing you deserve that and fighting for yourself to get it if it's not being given, right? Just yesterday, one of my consultants I work with, like, we were talking about some tech stuff that like I wasn't fully understanding, and I kept asking a question, and I thought she was avoiding it, and I was getting really triggered. Like my anxious side was coming out because I was like, why is she not answering my question? Why is she not answering my question? And so like I like finally was like sent her a voice note like, I don't understand why you're not answering my question. And she's like, I've answered it 3 times, and I just wasn't understanding it, right? But old me, and this is how you know that you're on the path to healing, when you start noticing what old you would have done.
Yes.
That, past you would have done this. Past me would have just been like, okay, well, I guess I'm not going to get that question answered. I'm just not going to understand. Right. And even though I came at her, like, I knew I was triggered. So like, I was softer than maybe my insides wanted me to be about it, because I've learned to manage my attachment style more. But I realized like, I knew I was deserving of getting my question answered.
Mm.
And I wasn't going to stop until I understood what was going on.
Mm-hmm.
And in that simple way, I was asking for what I needed in the situation. And we had a moment and we were able to work it out. And I was like, I'm so sorry I was badgering you like that. You absolutely did answer my question. I just wasn't understanding it. And she was like, it's totally cool. I get it, And she's a new mom too. So we're always like mom brain, let's give each other grace for our mom brain. So, but like even just that little thing, I was like, that's me loving myself.
Mm-hmm.
When we ask for what we need and we know we're deserving of the answer, of the time, of the attention, of whatever it is we're feeling we need, honoring that and treating yourself with like, to me, that is self-love,
Mm-hmm.
how we treat ourselves, how we talk to ourselves, how we think about ourselves, and how we expect others to treat us is a reflection of our love for ourselves.
Yes.
Right. Which is going back to my beginning of like, if I can be with someone like that who can't give me what I need, then what did that say about how I felt about myself?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Beautiful answer.
Thanks.
I have one more question, and then I will ask about where people can find you and for you to share about your work.
Great.
My favorite question to ask people. What is your favorite part about being a woman?
Ooh. Oh, that's a great question that I've never been asked before. Yeah, I think it is in relation to kind of your observation around creativity. And kind of in connection to what I had said about women, that permission and desire, not just the permission. I mean, we are given the permission, so maybe we lean into it more, but the ability and desire and, I don't know, to explore our inner landscape, I guess, and to, I don't know, I think when women are comfortable with themselves, they really are like healing agents for the whole world.
Yeah.
I think that when we are right with ourselves, and I think this is true for all people, not just women, but I think because of the way we're socialized and nurtured and all the things we were talking about, like we're so in tune with that side of ourselves, and that when we do finally give ourselves the permission to explore it, whether that's through fashion or through writing or creativity or whatever, like we do have the capacity, I think, to move mountains, because I think women are very much like maybe it's the natural instinct in us as mothers, whether you're actually a mother or not. I think all women have a certain level of a capability to act upon how they feel, right? To not just sit with it, but to like transmute that feeling into action that inspires other people.
Yeah, to express
you know?
it.
Yeah. And like that's why, not to infuse any politics here, just speaking in general, like not necessarily speaking about our specific politics at the time, but I think a woman would make an amazing president for that reason.
Me too.
Yeah. Because, people tend to think women are emotional, and it's like, yeah, but when a woman, just because a woman's emotional doesn't mean that her feelings are all over the place.
Yeah.
Right. Or that they rule her. A woman who is secure, centered, right, in her divine, greatest divinity, her greatest strength, like uses her emotions as wisdom for the greater good. Yeah.
For sure.
As guidance. Right. And we can't just use our logic to make decisions because we're cut off from how we feel. And we can't just use our emotions because we're cut off from logic. It's integrating those two things. And I think women as mothers and nurturers and caretakers are really good at intuitively knowing what to do and then being able and not questioning, like doing it when what needs to be done.
Yes. Oh, I love that.
Yeah. So I feel like that was like a few different things about women that I appreciate or what I enjoy about being a woman, but I do enjoy being able to feel these feelings, express them and act on them, and I can see how it makes things happen. And that feels really amazing and powerful to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I will be in a foreign country on election day, but I'm like really hoping to get the news that we have our first female president. And I'm so curious to see what that would be like being in a country that like looks at us and is like, what's going on over there?
Yeah. Well, other countries have had female presidents before. Yeah. We're actually behind in that regard. Yeah. We're ahead in the race regard though, actually. Yeah. But not gender.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
yeah. Well, I feel like this could be a whole other podcast episode too, because I could talk about that for a long time.
So for people listening, tell us about your work, where to find you, and all the things that you have going on.
Yes, thank you. The main place to find me is, well, first of all, you can always start with my website, truerlove.com, but I offer a variety of different things depending on where you are in your relationship journey. I work with people who are currently in a situation that's not moving forward or feeling good and they want to sort through it. I work with people who just broke up with someone. I work with people who are starting to date. So, and I work with people who are in relationships, but the key between all those things is moving towards security, right? And so one of the main things I offer that really, I think, hits a lot of those stages is my challenge. It's a 5-day challenge I offer. It's called Manifest Love on the Apps. And you do not have to be on a dating app actively to take it. Some people take it because they just broke up with someone and they just want to know, like, how would I approach it better next time, right? But essentially what I'm doing in that challenge, and it is specific to the apps because so many people meet people on the apps these days and so many people struggle because it's like our main way to meet people when we're dating, but also they suck and everyone hates them. So I really want to make that process easier for people because I met my own husband on Tinder and so many of my clients meet people on the apps, but everything I teach can be used off the apps as well. Because what I'm teaching is how to date through the lens of attachment. And so my challenge, Manifest Love on the Apps, is like a great introduction to that because it's helping you get on the path to being in that relationship, like just in those 5 days. Because we do like really transformational stuff. We start with the awareness, but then we move into the embodiment then. So that like people leave feeling so much more excited and hopeful and like confident based on everything we do. And it's just like a really beautiful thing. And so that's a really great way to find me. And so I am having a challenge in November 11th through 15th. And so you can sign up for that like a couple weeks before. It's Manifest Loves on the apps. .trueorlove.com/register. I know you're going to be putting the
It'll
links
be in the,
so
yeah.
I'm just so used to like giving these links. So that's a great way, but also my Facebook group and or my email list. Some people aren't on Facebook, but I send it via email. And the same things that I, talk about in my Facebook group. But my Facebook group is a really nice place because I found that like when I was like talking about this kind of stuff on Instagram, it would attract people who like would be following alive, who like are just didn't feel safe for the people who want to work through this kind of stuff. And so it's really nice, the Facebook group, because it's a very supportive community of people who are all at these different stages in a relationship and working often through an attachment wound. And so I do trainings every Monday, and I just have a ton of resources in there. If you're getting started on this journey, we do the challenge within the Facebook group. But if you get on my email list through my website, or through Instagram, then you can also get all of those updates and all of those videos.
Nice.
So I know that was a really long answer, but that's where people can find me. And my Facebook group is called Manifesting Secure Love.
Beautiful. And you mentioned to me before we recorded that this challenge is something you do. Do you do it every year, or you?
Yeah, I do it a few times a year.
Okay. Yeah, just in case anyone's listening to this and it's like 6 months after this has been out.
Right. Yes. And my link doesn't change. So you can always go to that link and you'll see like what the most recent challenge is.
Okay, cool. So all of those links will be below.
Yeah. But also if you're in the Facebook group, that's the best way. Like if
that makes
we're
sense.
not in a challenge or something, because then you'll always know, or you're on my email list, you'll always know what's coming up next. Yeah. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for spending time with me today. I feel like there were so many bits that like I could have gone off into a tangent of like, no.
Same.